Welcome to Fortress on a Hill. I'm Henry.
I'm Danny.
I'm Keagan.
We're three leftist veterans that aim to expose the reality of the U.S. military's multiple wars abroad and to illuminate the damage military service does to Americans.
American presidents throughout U.S. history have used American military and diplomatic power to force regime change of democratically elected governments around the world.
Most veterans come from families vested in prior service, and American generals choose their own, ensuring diversity of thought never interferes with American warmongering.
How can we stand by and do nothing while our military kills and destroys lives the world over, while telling Americans that all this death and destruction protects them from terrorists when nothing could be more false?
Fortress on a Hill aims to change that.
Tom Secker, welcome back to Fortress on a Hill.
Thanks for having me back, man. I mean, it's been a little while since we spoke last. The last one was Platoon, wasn't it?
I believe so. Yeah, I think the last one we talked about was Platoon.
So yeah, great to be talking to you again, as always.
Yeah, I'm glad to have you here. So today we're going to talk about the third film in Oliver Stone's Vietnam trilogy, Heaven and Earth. It is a pretty big step away from traditional American war movies, and even from Platoon and Born on the 4th of July in some ways. And I think it was done really well, and I think that the like we were talking about before we started recording, to give a full arc of someone's character, to see them as a young person, where they come from, up through, all the various stages of becoming an adult, and especially to understand what it means when war is a unrequested dance partner in that person's life. And it also gives us with Platoon, we saw, Chris Taylor beginning to end of his deployment there, on the ground in Vietnam. And then with Born on the 4th of July, we had Ron's arc from, it had a couple scenes as a kid, didn't it? But most of it was, late teenager through the convention, the Democratic National Convention that they showed it in, if I remember correctly.
Yeah. I mean, this one is more like Born on the 4th of July, but it's sort of even bigger in terms of the scope of the central character's life. Born on the 4th basically starts with him being about 17. I think, like you say, there are a couple of childhood scenes, but I don't remember them, so they clearly didn't have that much impact. And yeah, we see him from there through to, I'm not sure how many years after he returns from Vietnam.
It didn't seem like it was very long.
It's not that many, clearly. It's not like this is a 15, 20-year arc that he goes on. Whereas in Heaven and Earth, it's, 40 years of her life, almost, something like that.
Yeah, it's quite extensive.
There's a lot in there. There's an awful lot that happens in this movie for a film that isn't at all really action-based and isn't even that fast-paced.
No.
It manages to cram so much of this woman's life onto the screen. I think that was probably my overriding impression, just from a kind of film craft point of view, is that it was clearly an incredibly ambitious screenplay to try to tell so much story in one movie. It's like 2 hours. It's not even that long a movie.
Yeah.
It's like there's enough story in there for a 12-episode TV season. Probably more than enough, to be honest, that they could have, you could stretch it out that far, and I don't think it would seem thin. And I don't want to say it's the best of the three Vietnam films. I mean, I guess Stone has actually made more than 3 Vietnam films, since most of his films are ultimately in some way about the Vietnam War. But the trilogy, the sort of recognized Stone Vietnam trilogy, I wouldn't say it's the best one. I'd say some aspects of it are the best out of those 3. they're all terrific movies. I found this one wonderfully metaphysical, for one thing, and just very, very touching. I mean, the other two are emotional films, powerful films. They didn't kind of touch me emotionally as deeply as this one did. Yeah, that would be my basic kind of first impressions of it, overall impressions of it.
Yeah, there was a kind of catharsis that came across in this one that the other two, I assume by design, did not have. And just to get started with it, I really enjoyed the fact that the story went back as far as, I think it was 1953, when the French first came to Vietnam. And in terms of us understanding, the full historical arc, that I don't know that most people could tell you that the French were there before American advisors arrived in the late 50s, early 60s. And to understand what happens to a region, both the people that live there and the environment, and what war does to it. In looking over my notes last night, I was thinking about there's a Bedouin groupings of Iraqis that used to populate southern Iraq, and because of the waterways that they were able to grow crops in have all been destroyed between American bombings and going after oil and all the other wonderful things that American occupation bring to a place like Iraq. But I was trying to think about the before, and it's not often in a war film that you see a genuine before. This was before anyone came. It's such a beautiful place, such a neat place, and that it also begins with her and her family discussing about their connections to the land through their ancestors, which is something else that is it's I don't want to say it's not American, but it's not common for Americans to have that point of view. We don't modern Americans don't take the long look in terms of what their ancestors did, what they contributed, didn't contribute, anything like that. So it was really refreshing to see that, them make those kind of connections, and that is something that we miss as Americans, is that Western viewpoint, that there were things here before. There were however many million Native Americans in the United States before American settler colonialism kicked in, and all these people got killed or forced out.
Oh, it's the same. I mean, perhaps going back even further, it's the same coming from a major European power. I mean, people in this country don't feel that kind of attachment to the land for various reasons, obviously. But I guess we only feel it as a kind of collective nationalistic thing, that there is still a fair amount of like proud to be British, and Britain's sort of important and special, and we're the British and therefore we're important and special. Yeah. All of that. But it's only really through that mechanism that we feel that attachment to our ancestry and our past. And obviously there's a lot of like nostalgic yearning for the empire, and there again, it's sort of, well, everywhere that was part of the British Empire existed a long time before we turned up. Mm-hmm. And some of those places had all kinds of stuff going on that we in fact wrecked. And other places perhaps weren't very developed. And I mean, there's some positive, obviously, consequences of the British Empire. I think the negative consequences massively outweigh them. But yeah, it's still that very much that sort of not even the white man's burden, more like they're lucky to have us. They're lucky to have been colonized by a people as great as the British. There is that idea is still about, but it's all funneled into nationalism and militarism. It isn't like about being proud of our culture or proud of our language or any of the actual good things about Britain. It's all the worst aspects that kind of emotion is inspired by and then funneled into. And yeah, it's lovely to have a film that takes such a long view and such a broad view, but also that has a real kind of emotional and, as I say, metaphysical depth to it. That there is meaning for these people in this land. It's not just a place to live and, you know, grow food and all the rest of it. It's something much more profound than that, whether it be a religious thing or a familial ancestry thing or a whole bunch of other stuff. You know, all of the above ultimately is implied at one point in the movie. And yeah, so unusual for an American film, or even a British film for that matter, to even acknowledge any of that stuff, let alone make it a core part of the story and of the protagonist's arc.
I also loved that the lead character in the film was a woman. You can't find very many war films that have female leads of any kind, and especially ones that are not Caucasian, that are not the white leads, the American or the British ones. And I was reading through some of the reviews last night, just kind of wanted to see what other people said, and the consensus was that that the main character arc wasn't as good as Platoon or Born on the 4th of July. And I thought, does that have anything to do with because she's a woman and because the roles in society and the roles in warfare are that this film, this story diverges from them in such a major way? Because I didn't notice any of that. I don't know about you, but I didn't feel like that the arc of it was less powerful. It is certainly, it is much more comprehensive and delves into a bit more interpersonal stuff, I think. But but that didn't make it any less powerful to me. And I wondered if the reason that because it was a female lead that male reviewers would not be as inclined to see this person as I guess a battlefield equal, if we want to call it that.
Yeah. I think there's definitely an element of that in those sorts of negative comments about the story arc, or at least the protagonist's arc, because so much of it is told in small moments, especially the segment after she gets to America. A lot of this is like dinner table stuff. It's very profound and important, and it's all, signifying something much greater and bigger than what's actually going on domestically. But it's told through that sort of scene. Whereas most of what happens in, say, Born on the 4th of July is very high drama. It's kind of high drama from start to finish, whereas Heaven and Earth tells it in much more smaller moments that in themselves, a lot of them aren't that dramatic. So I think there's probably an element of that too. But yeah, of course, it's that, when you have a central character, they're not only telling a story from a perspective that you either haven't seen before or certainly haven't seen very much of before, but also through a character that isn't the sort of character you expect to see be the anchor for a film like this. I mean, I can understand just as a sort of natural instinct, people aren't going to feel as much for her as they do for Tom Cruise in Born on the 4th of July, or, Charlie Sheen's character in Platoon. Because it's not so immediately apparent to them why this matters and why they should care just as much about this story, if not more so, than the previous Oliver Stone stories. But I had the opposite reaction. I think the actress is absolutely wonderful. I found her totally captivating at almost every moment of this film. Not just in a sort of, man watching a woman kind of a way, but, in a much more deep way than that. I cared about this character. I wanted her to succeed. I wanted things to get better for her. I wanted to see these things, her life get better and her overcome these demons. And I certainly felt that in the other two movies, but not quite the same extent, because I don't think they got into the emotional side quite as explicitly. This is a much more feminine film. It sort of wears its emotions on its sleeve more, I think. And yeah, I mean, when this film came out, I'm guessing 98% of film reviewers were white men, and they're just not as likely, even though we're sitting here, two white guys saying the exact opposite, but it's just not what they were expecting. And a lot of, especially film reviewers who probably watch 3 films a day and review all of them, they're used to stereotypes, they're used to simplicity. This is not a simple film. This has layers and complexity beyond what almost any other American film of the last sort of my lifetime, in my lifetime, has actually managed to accomplish. There's probably a handful of others that I'm not thinking of, but this is right up there. And layers of emotional complexity. It's not like geopolitics. This isn't a thriller. This isn't where, it's a complex plot that's a social commentary or something. This is more about a person's actual lived experience. And so that's harder to immediately grab hold of and understand the significance of. So I think they've kind of just missed the point, to be honest.
Oh yeah, absolutely. So around the time that the French came to Li Lai's village, which her family home ended up getting burned to the ground, and it was kind of an initial salvo for her in understanding war. And you could see a lot of confusion in her trying to understand why this happened. And then it carried on a bit to later when the Viet Cong actually arrived in her village and gathered everybody together and explained, there's this war coming, we want you to be on our side of it. And you could see in her dad's face almost all you needed to know about his experience with it, because he was already at that place of understanding what war meant and what it could mean to the people that he loved. And there was some confusion with Li Lai in looking at her dad. Why was he doing this? Or what was paining him so greatly? But that goes back into that generational experience. That their culture was very steeped in tradition, understanding one's ancestors, and that the lessons of what had happened in 1953 with the French. I want to say that there was, prior to that, there was a Chinese occupation that happened adjacent to World War II, or it may have been the Japanese. I can't remember. But anyways, it was a place where a lot of war had happened over a very long period of time. But just seeing her old man come to terms with that, and come to terms with understanding the death and destruction that may be coming, it was really really powerful to me. And then
I did like the kind of contrast in that moment between, or that little sequence between her confusion and his sort of, it's not quite steely resolve in a typical American sense, but he seems to grasp that the shock of what's just happened might only be the opening salvo, or just the latest salvo in an ongoing series of invasions of their home. That he's in some way a mirror to her experience. That because he has, like you say, this much greater wisdom of and knowledge of just how many times this has happened, and how easy it is in some ways for this to happen. And thus he kind of processes the shock. That's not quite what I'm trying to say. That he feels the pain of what has happened, but that he can't in any way give in to it, because he knows it's probably coming again. And of course that is exactly what then happens. And we all know, watching this film, I doubt there's anyone who's watched this film who isn't at least somewhat familiar with the Vietnam War, and that at least that happened. They know it's coming again. We're watching this, we all know
Yeah.
His prediction, his sort of intuition is going to come true. And that's what I mean about the metaphysical side of it, that he has no particular rational reason, he has no immediate evidence for believing that, but he's damn right.
Yeah.
And we know he is. And that kind of connection between the audience and a secondary character like that, it really helps create a degree of compassion and a degree of empathy for what these people are going through, that because we can feel this, that his intuition is going to come true because we know it ultimately did, it's much easier for us to basically put ourselves in his shoes, to actually feel something and understand something of what that must have been like to go through. And that kind of connection with someone who, let's face it, most of us will never meet that person. Most of us will probably never know anything about those people who went through that in a sort of first-hand direct experience way. So again, just as Platoon and Born on the 4th of July managed to build some bridges of compassion and managed to actually move that dialogue about the Vietnam War forward and helped, actually do something with all of that grief and pain, that was constructive and in some way beautiful, or at least very honest. This film manages it, but manages it with Vietnamese protagonists. And that's not easy to do. My phone keeps going off. Sorry, I'll mute it. That really impressed me, because it's not necessarily something I would normally buy into, or I certainly wouldn't buy into it if it was done in a shallow tokenistic way, whereas this film does it with such depth that I did buy into it and actually was, like I say, just really rooting for these people.
Yeah, it's I would love to be able to tell a story like this in in the shoes of Iraqis, in the shoes of people under the American occupation, and to have those same kind of sentiments, those their own connection to their surroundings and trying to make sense of it, because they also have the long arc of war between between everything that happened there, the Iraq-Iran War, Persian Gulf War, our sanctions, all that stuff. But so next we move into Lee Lai's relationship with both the Viet Cong and the newly arrived South Vietnamese military. And it very clearly shows how difficult it is for her to attempt to balance that. I don't know what I would say, that she seemed like she had a greater connection to the VC there, but that it was because her brother had joined up with them. There was a lot of tied up emotion for her in how they behaved, what they did. Is my brother going to be okay? And knowing that these are the guys that come in the night. These are the guys that aren't going to just walk up on a patrol to your home. They're people that know your village, know your who you are, and although they didn't give any clear-cut understanding about where loyalties lie, because she saw her teacher get murdered by the South Vietnamese, according to them, for being a VC sympathizer, or was it teaching them on the VC's behalf, something like that. So she got to see that. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Well, I mean, just to jump in on what you're saying here, yeah, I very much felt that sequence was a little bit confusing, in as much as she clearly does have some kind of mixed loyalties here, and she clearly does have some kind of internal conflict as to quite where she positions herself in the midst of all of these different factions. But there again, that's something that's so wonderful about this movie, is that you get to see several waves of people, different people, coming to this village, mostly bringing a fair amount of chaos and violence with them in one form or another, from all sorts of different angles. So you very much get the sense of, this is just some, little place that's caught in the crossfire between all of these different factions struggling for control, or whatever it is that they're trying to do and trying to achieve. So naturally, she would have some degree of split loyalties and confusion about this. So even though I found that part of the film a bit confusing, I think that was the entire point. That we're not quite supposed to, this isn't a simple story of you're supposed to be on this side rather than that side. You're basically on her side. But even her side, because she's somewhat confused and divided on it, that's where you end up. So again, it's about, building that compassionate bond between a protagonist and an audience, so that they actually understand something of what that must have been like. It's very well done. Very well done.
Yeah. I appreciated that they did, make it confusing. That it was, that the to understand, to actually have to be physically stuck between two actual armies, between two entirely different groups of actual soldiers who, like you said, the only prominent thing that they bring is death and destruction. That's not what they say, but that is definitely what they do. And I really liked her. There's just a little bit later, she started having nightmares about her brother being thrown from a helicopter. And there was a comment that she made about that the ant in the anthill never moves up; they only move further in terms of that that their chosen loyalty to the VC. We may see it as this person that clearly has sympathies with the VC, but could it also just simply be because they live and work right there beside them? That there is, that because there are members of it that are within the community but may not be shouting to the rooftops about their affiliation, that informant on informant, that they really know what's going on, but there's no chance for them to get into a position of authority or leadership, that if they try to become a bigger part of it, they just bury themselves deeper. There's just the quicksand becomes that much worse in those moments.
Absolutely, yeah.
So then she is arrested and tortured, brutally raped by some of the VC soldiers there, which to me came across as just the most giant of betrayals, because of the things that she had done on behalf of the VC, that she had tried really hard to attempt to be in their good graces, if for no other reason than to protect herself and protect her family. And then she gets arrested and raped, and then the worst thing of it all is that she is exiled from her village, that because they consider her to be an informer of some form and function, that she can't be there anymore. And unlike a typical Western point of view, her village is her entire world. That's where she's lived her entire life. It's where the spirits of her ancestors live. That being ripped away from that is almost it's almost a social womb of sorts, of the in the bosom of her family, if we want to coin it that way. And that was really hard to see. That was really hard to watch her go through that. And carrying all these different traumas between her treatment from the VC after working on their behalf, to the VC being the ones that tell her she's disloyal and kick her out of the village. But I would say that was one of the first big betrayals that she goes through in a film filled with betrayals of different kinds.
Mm, mm. And in some ways, her being exiled from the village is actually worse than what happens to her before that.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, that's, fucking bad enough, for sure. But it's then followed with this. Yeah, you're basically talking about, a pretty, I don't want to say a simple girl, but a girl with very limited life experience, but at the same time, a very serious bond to her family and her village and the land around it and all of that. That is in some way the worst crime against her at this point in the movie. Or at least that's certainly something that touched me very deeply. That, like you, I had quite a strong response to that. It's kind of terrible. On the other hand, it does lead to my favorite part of the movie. So I guess I can live with it. But, yeah.
What was that? What was your favorite part of the movie?
Well, the next sequence where she's forced to move to the city, and she has to adapt, and we get to see her intelligence and certainly her sense of humor really starts shining through. In that piece. I found myself laughing at her quite a lot. There's something, I don't know why this is. There is something I find quite amusing when I hear women swear really bluntly, and the number of people that she tells to fuck off in that next sort of section of the story is pretty high, and it's all in every moment entirely appropriate. It's the appropriate response, because it's like there's various men harassing her and people trying to steal her money and all the rest of it. And yeah, that's after the suffering of that first. I mean, this isn't a 3-act story; it's more like a 5-act story. The suffering in that first act, it was very gratifying to see her, okay, she's forced into this position where she has to take more control of her life and she has to now make all these decisions for herself. But seeing her do that was great. I just really, really enjoy that part of a story where someone is struggling, but actually manages to overcome quite a lot of those obstacles. The stuff that she overcomes in this movie is extraordinary. And again, I just found, like I keep saying, I found myself rooting for her all the time.
There was there was one little piece I wanted to talk about with that. I don't want to call it a mansion, but the people that her mom and her were working for just prior to her becoming homeless, before she has to start selling stuff to GIs and learning the power of fuck off. As with American GIs, which it's generally all you need to know. You just tell them to fuck off, and most of them fuck off. But that she had slept with the master of the house, which I aside from what happened to her with the VC, and not that's a sexual experience that someone should.
I know what you're saying. Yeah,
it's certainly not a good thing, but it is something that she went through. But in terms of the first time that she willingly had sex with somebody else, and you can see that that relationship between her and the master, it was very, very short, but in terms of that, there was a bit of safety there, a bit of familiarity, and then she finds the very hard place to be after the missus of the house finds out that she's been sleeping with her husband, and her mom, in trying to convince the missus to let them stay there, offers Leli to become a second wife to this man. And you see in her face, in Leli's face, just this horrible state of betrayal in doing that now, and I understand what the mom's place was in trying to do that. She was trying to give her daughter a safe place to be. You know, that they had talked about that it was a nicer place and they had decent food and that they, you know, it wasn't a horrible place to be. But in mom offering that for Leli, there's that horrible betrayal, but at the same time the mom is trying to protect her kid. She's trying to give her what she sees is the best situation from that. And then she's completely cut off. She's already been exiled from the village, but at that point, she gets cut off from all of her family from back in the village. I don't remember where mom goes at that point. I think she goes back.
Nor do I.
What?
Nor do I. I think she goes back to the village.
Yeah, that's what I thought. And so, you know, she ends up living intermittently with her sister, who is working as a prostitute there in Saigon. And she's trying to sell stuff, just trying to make do, going through the base garbage, trying to find food to eat, trying to find things to sell. And then she ends up moving into that whole realm, you know, telling GIs to fuck off because all of them want to have sex with her. And then there are the ones that it's not that they won't take no for an answer, but they try 7 or 8 more times thinking that she's just trying to get more money, when the reality is she doesn't want to. She doesn't want to at all. Then it comes to that 2 GIs offer her $400 to have sex with them, which then for what she was going through was an astronomical amount of money. It's just, I mean, it's especially from being homeless and everything. And you see her really, you know, burden herself with that, you know, is that $400 would really, really help her. At this point, she has a kid, has a little boy, and is trying to figure out what to do. And although it doesn't connect directly, this kind of brings me back to, you know, her issues of being with the VC, you know, and dealing with them in the Southern Vietnamese army, that in terms of finding a happy medium spot, you know, how close do I get to these people? How close do I get to those people? Can I really trust any of them versus I need to eat, my kid needs to eat? You know, I'm sure lots of the guys that worked on bases that I lived on in Iraq did not want to work there, but where was the other work going to come from? You know, in war, especially in those times, other than, you know, and you have to pick your poison. You know, I can work for this army, I can work for that army. But the people around you start to respond to that, and you have to live with it. Okay, I'll shut up for a minute so you can talk.
No, sure. Yeah. I mean, that's I think one of the reasons, aside from what I've already said about this segment of the film and this segment of the story, the other thing that I really, really love about it is the sense of pragmatism that not everyone, most of the people in this situation are trying to find the least worst thing to do. Like with her mother appealing to the, you know, the master of the house's wife and all of that. Again, it's not that her mother is in any way evil. She is quite, you know, you understand what she's trying to do and why. And even if you think, I wouldn't have done that in that situation or whatever, doesn't really matter. It's, again, it's this much more feminine approach to storytelling, where it's more about understanding why people do the things they do and what's important to them. And that carries throughout this whole section. It's not just the practical, pragmatic challenge of, you know, I've got to, like you say, I've got to feed myself, I've got to feed my kid and everything, but also the challenge of, I guess, figuring out what it is that she really wants in this situation, because she's up to that point kind of just been parachuted into this. Most of the major things that have happened were not her fault and weren't of her choosing. And then, like you say, you get this situation with the two GIs offering her this extraordinary amount of money to prostitute herself, essentially. And yeah, what choice would you make in that situation? It's very difficult to know. It's kind of impossible to know until you're actually in it, I guess. And that sense really came through. That, that very down-to-earth human sense of, well, you can't pick and choose the situation around you. You can only pick and choose your own responses to it and which opportunities or whatever come your way you actually try and pursue. And again, I really sympathized with her throughout all of this, but also enjoyed watching it, enjoyed watching someone go through that maturing and that realization that, her choices really matter.
Mm-hmm.
And that she has some. Because up until that point, she doesn't really have that many choices. And that's... Yeah, I just had a great affection for that part of the movie, not just because it made me laugh, but because it's something I think we've all found ourselves in that at some point in our life. Not quite like what she had to go through, but something akin to that, of where you realize you're in a fairly desperate situation of some kind or another, whether it be financial, emotional, whatever. But that you do ultimately have some degree of choice, and you have some degree of power, no matter how much chaos is surrounding you. And yeah, it's just sort of a beautiful thing, a beautiful story to tell because of that, because it's about things that, it's not just about the Vietnam War at all. It's about so much more than that, and things that I think almost anyone, certainly beyond the age of like 30 or something, possibly even younger, would be able to relate to this. And, it's by far the least successful of Oliver Stone's Vietnam films. Hardly anyone has seen this film in relative terms. And like I say, in some ways, it's the best of the bunch. So I hope, I guess where I'm really going with this is also that I hope that anyone who hasn't already seen Heaven and Earth, or hasn't seen it in a long time, like I hadn't before I rewatched it so that we could have this conversation, go back and give it a rewatch. There is so much in this movie that's great, and there is so much in it that is provocative and will hopefully bring out the best in you. Because I know I keep mentioning the word compassion, but that's what this film is. It's an extremely compassionate film. And if it helps inspire the people watching it to be more compassionate, then that's a bloody good thing.
Absolutely. Absolutely. We have far too many war films that compassion is, at best, a faraway secondary character, if it's mentioned at all. And I think that they should create more films like this, especially to understand the cyclical nature of war and what it does to people over multiple generations. So the next big thing in the story is Steve. And Steve is he's a E6 Marine, who's stationed in Saigon or near Saigon. And trying to remember, I want to say they saw each other on the street first, and then he tracked her down later, and had to find out where she was at. And there's this really long, I don't know if we want to call it a courtship, but a period where she doesn't really want anything to do with him. She believes that he's, just another GI, that he probably wants sex and nothing else. And Steve goes out of his way to demonstrate that he's genuine, that what you see is what you get, that he cares for her son, and you can see her trying to, her fighting that impulse of wanting to put any trust into him. She's gotten to this place where she is, she's kind of protecting herself and her son, but it's a very tight circle, and there isn't room for Steve in it. And he, he really demonstrates that to her over time. And one exchange that they had that was really powerful to me, and we've already touched on it a little bit, but that she mentions about that Americans don't care about their ancestors, that they don't care what they do to the world. Now, Americans, historically speaking, we have a very tight, rigorous, ranked ancestry that most Americans cling to, our founding myths and such, but they don't come full circle in understanding not just what those men said, but what they really did, their actual lived lives and the destruction that came with that. And Steve, like me, when I joined the Army, like I'm sure like many people when they join the military, that's the ancestry, if we want to call it that they carry with them. But they don't carry with them, being deployed to Iraq, they don't carry with them what the U.S. military has done there over the last 50 to 70 years, which absolutely, should fit into that history. But you see this very clear contrast between the two of them. And Steve does have some good redeeming qualities, but he doesn't look at life in that same way that she does. He doesn't have the long view of understanding those things. He tells her very specifically that he's looking for an Oriental wife. That is the reason. I mean, he cares for her. He shows her that and stuff, but that is his ultimate goal. Then we come to the evacuation of Saigon towards the end of the war. That there's just chaos everywhere. Steve told her that her and her son were on a list to be able to access one of the bases, to be able to get a ride home. He finds them in Saigon and actually physically puts them on a helicopter, and tells it, it was, like I said, it was absolute chaos there in terms of the initial American pullout from Vietnam. But he puts them on this helicopter and tells it to leave. He's still on the ground. There's not room for him on the bird. And he says, you get, I'll come and I'll find you later. And then he's listed as missing in action. So there's a period there where she's not sure if he's even still alive. And that whole area, that whole section of the film really nails down the desperation that's happening for people in that time, wanting to be able to get safe, especially if, that now for Ly Lai being the partner of an American GI, that the North Vietnamese or the VC will not look kindly on her if they happen to find her. And what did you think about that part, Tom?
Well, again, it's a bit like the village in the opening act of the film. Is she's very much caught in the crossfire of all of this, and I mean, I don't know, the sequence with the helicopter. I mean, I don't know whether this actually happened in reality. Did feel, I guess it only felt a little bit hackneyed to me because I've seen it so many times, not because inherently there's anything actually wrong with that, little piece of the story. And that's a tiny little gripe in an otherwise outstanding, amazing film. Yeah, again, it's the way this film manages, because one of the cliches that's said in reviews about this movie is it tells a story about the Vietnam War from the Vietnamese perspective. I'm sure you've stumbled across this phrase in some reviews you saw. And I'm thinking that's not what this film is really doing, because there is no one Vietnamese perspective.
No.
And the film does brilliantly at showing you that. that in fact the Vietnamese people were divided in so many different ways. And okay, it's largely told through the story of one woman's perspective, but it is also a film where, like you say with Steve, he is actually quite charming and likable, especially in this part of the film. There's quite a funny scene between the two of them where she keeps telling him to leave and he doesn't. But he doesn't do so in a sort of like aggressive, nasty way. He's just I'm wooing you. I'm not just going to give up kind of a way, which is quite likable. I mean, I'm not sure if I would actually approve of that sort of behavior, but whatever. In terms of the film, it makes you like him, or at least understand where he's coming from. And that's what I think the real strength of this movie is not it's telling you it from a so-called Vietnamese perspective. It's that it's pointing out there are so many different perspectives here, and a degree of understanding and compassion of all of them would actually help all of us heal somewhat in terms of coming to terms with this total fucking disaster of a war. And that applies to everyone. That applies to Steve. It applies to our protagonist. It applies to her family. You know, everyone in this film ultimately kind of suffers to some extent, and all of them have some degree of scars or grief or whatever it may be. And that's ultimately what the film is trying to achieve, is not tell you a story from a particular perspective, but make you aware of all the different perspectives and why actually you should care for all of these people to some extent. Except, you know, obviously the bastards, you know, the VC who rape her. I mean, I don't really give a shit about them, but pretty much everyone else in this film, I can, to some extent, see where they're coming from and why they're doing what they're doing. And I think that's such a strong thing and such an unusual thing, especially in a war movie. Because in a war movie, it's like sometimes you'll get, you know, critics praising something. Oh, it tells both sides. And it's like, there isn't only two sides to this damn thing.
Yeah.
You know, can we not have a bit more imagination, and can our compassion not extend a bit beyond simple binary thinking or some crap like that? And I know this is one of the problems of film reviewers. They talk in cliches because they're watching a lot of cliched movies. But yeah, again, I just think those reviewers who said that missed the point spectacularly. This film has so much more to offer than that. And this segment where those two are, you know, falling in love and then are ripped apart really tells that, really brings that home.
The guys and I love doing the podcast. Being able to share our experiences in the military with allies and supporters means the world to us. But we can't do all the work. We need you to share an episode of ours with someone, anyone whom you might think would be affected by it. Young people looking to join the military, or parents advocating for one, conscientious citizens who care about the violence the U.S. wages in their name, advocates for women and people of color who understand the harsh environment the military creates for minorities and inflicts on minorities across the globe, and anyone else you think it might affect. Please take a moment and share this with them. Our podcast is supported in a few different ways. First, there's Patreon, where we're blessed to have an array of wonderful supporters, helping the guys and I pay for some of the podcast's expenses. Those who contribute $10 a month or more will be mentioned right here as an honorary producer, helping keep you, our listeners, stocked with new episodes. But you don't have to contribute $10 a month to help us. For as little as $1 a month, you can help keep us going, paying for hosting and storage fees, transcribing old and new episodes, promoting and expanding the podcast, and more I'm sure I can't think of at the moment. So let's bring out our honorary producers, and they are Will Arens, Fahim Shirazi, James O'Barr, Adam Bellows, Eric Phillips, Paul Appel, Julie Dupree, Thomas Benson, Emma P., Janet Hansen, Tristan Oliver, Daniel Fleming, Michael Karen, Jason, Zach H., Ren Jacob, and the Status Quo podcast. Your contributions are wonderfully helpful to us. Thank you so much. However, if Patreon isn't your style, you can contribute directly to us through PayPal at paypal.me/Fortress on a Hill. or please check out our awesome store on Spreadshirt.com for some great Fortress merch. The link is in the show notes. And now, let's get back to the podcast. I think that, that it's also about, we're so entitled when it comes to how many different viewpoints are told in a war film, a Western war film, and that that we can make movies that are so much on the DoD side that they provide literal support and get to actually change the script. And we haven't got to that that part of talking about the concept of soul dead in the movie, but that it essentially could be understood as what we now think of as moral injury in some way, and that the Department of Veterans Affairs acknowledges moral injury, acknowledges this idea that service members can come back with this incredible weight on their shoulders from the things that they did or the things that they saw. But the Department of Defense does not acknowledge moral injury. It doesn't. And so we're as especially as Americans, we're so tunnel visioned by our concept of what war is, and of the possibility of there being more than two sides, more than seven sides, in terms of understanding that kind of thing. We're so indoctrinated to take the government line and call it, bless it as being the line, the narrative, the ideas we're wrapping ourselves around, without any further debate. And especially with the absence of female narratives of, that all of the events that happen in heaven and earth could have happened to a man. And it could, that could have been an interesting story in and of itself, but that it demonstrated what happened to a woman. And we're, that's so out in left field for Western cinema in a war film. If we, and this isn't just a war film, but it's definitely a film about war. But know that there's that cognitive dissonance between all the different sides. The rah we're happy we went to war, we served our country, we did our duty, whatever the hell people want to say, and understanding the real damage that happens to people and them acknowledging it. And we don't do that. So it's, looking at it in that way. And like you mentioned, with the reviewers are cliched, watching however many films, being used to the tropes and believing that they, this added with this means that. This was beyond them. The entirety of this plot, of this narrative, was something that I don't know that modern Americans, especially modern American movie reviewers, could empathize with or even try to understand. It's, that there would be assholes like oh, she was on the side of the VC, I'm done watching this movie, I'm turning it off.
Yeah.
I'm not even going to acknowledge that. And that's the thing, is that we have to be willing to acknowledge all those sides. And we've gotten so used to ignoring everybody that when something comes out that doesn't ignore those sides, that we don't know what the hell to do with it.
You make a very good point about the role of women in war movies, because their role is, if you go back over the hundreds and hundreds of British and American made war movies, they're either absent completely, they're just not in the story, they are nurses looking after wounded soldiers or some such, or they are wives worrying about their men off at war.
That's it. That's all.
In the last 5 to 10 years, largely due to the entertainment liaison offices, you've seen a bit more, you can actually occasionally have a woman in a combat role, but it'll usually be quite tokenistic, and ultimately she's not, that good. She's certainly not going to be crucial to the plot. It's very rare. bit more in spy movies, they're somewhat more progressive in massive inverted commas in that respect. But in war movies, it's like if there are any women there, they're kind of secondary. It's like almost like they're trying to they're waving a flag saying, yes, women are just as good as men, but we don't really believe that.
Yeah.
And that's it, pretty much. There aren't very many war movies that deviate from those very, very standard stereotypical tropes. And yet this one, the whole movie's about a woman. It's, she's the protagonist. The whole film and story revolves around her. I can't think of another war movie that does that. I'm trying to think of another military movie that does that. And the only one that's really coming to mind is G.I. Jane, which is a fairly terrible film and where it's certainly not a feminist film.
No.
It may have been attempting to be one, but it isn't one. So, yeah, that in itself is very subversive. And I think one of the reasons why studios didn't look at this as a big moneymaker, because they're like, well, certainly at that time, they didn't think women would go and see war movies really no matter what. Mm-hmm. They didn't see any real box office in it. And most fundamentally, I don't think even if they saw a commercial potential in this movie, they don't know how to market it. Mm-hmm. They don't know how to sell something like this to people, because how do you easily sell this? It's such a complex, layered story. It's so emotionally deep, but not in a way that you can ever get across in a trailer for it. Actually, I don't know how on earth you would market this film.
It would be hard to do. It really would, yeah.
And I'm a lot more broad-minded than most Hollywood marketing executives. So yeah.
So now we move over to the stateside part of the story. The Leli actually moving with Steve to the U.S., to California. I'm assuming near Camp Pendleton, where I want to say that's where he was stationed. And I loved the introduction of Leli standing there in front of a giant but typical American refrigerator and just looking at all the food in it. And, and at this point, she's in terms of trying to survive just by the skin of her teeth, protecting herself and her son, to see this consumerism up close and personal and just how huge it is. I could see my jaw being dropped at that moment too. And going to the supermarket, and seeing all the food that is available, seeing how, but just seeing this long line of consumerism of kind of capitalism run amok. I thought that was a really good comment for us, because it wasn't so much about owning things or having a fridge filled with food. It's just about how much this unending pile of stuff, and what does it really mean for us. And I really liked looking at that through the lens of her, of seeing that just this dumbfoundedness about trying to understand that American experience, that more consumerist experience that comes from being in the States.
And again, to go back to what I was saying before, that isn't like a Vietnamese perspective on American consumerism. No. That's just the same perspective pretty much anyone would have who hasn't previously experienced this, which is, most of the people in the world. Mm-hmm. So, and yeah, correct me if I'm wrong, isn't there a bit where she's in the supermarket and she's like looking through all the different rice that's available, and she's like, I want to say she picks up a great big like sack of rice because she doesn't understand that, oh no, you can come again in 3 days' time and buy more. Yeah. And it will always be there and you don't have to worry. And obviously that isn't actually strictly true. And increasingly so, we're seeing how, supply lines are somewhat breaking down, and that there are sort of mysterious food shortages. I mean, there are in this country at the moment, in, there's strange things that you just can't buy currently. And that's only going to, I think, happen more and more so. But at that point in time, it was like, you don't have to think. She's still thinking in terms of how much rice can I get today,
Mhm.
given how much money I have, in the
Yep.
hope that I'll have enough rice going forward into the future. She's not thinking like an American consumer at all, but yet that is ultimately the life she's now kind of trying to live. And just like in the previous act of the film, it's her adapting to this new circumstance, and in most ways doing very well at it, you know. And where she doesn't do well, it's quite funny.
Yeah.
It's not like she comes across as stupid or backward or anything. It's more just like, this is what it would be like if you've just never experienced this stuff before. And yeah, food is quite a big theme in this little section of the movie. In fact, I think throughout this whole kind of central act of the movie, you see like lots of food being thrown away,
Mm-hmm.
uneaten. And it's like, that just wouldn't happen in most of the world. They wouldn't just take a like half-eaten chicken leg and just toss it away. They can't afford to. And so that kind of thing really hits home, but hits home in a way that isn't condescending and patronizing towards us, you know, gluttonous Westerners, especially. It's just sort of saying, this is actually the reality for most people in the world.
Mm-hmm.
And maybe, you know, count yourself lucky that that isn't your reality. But told through this, like I say, quite humorous adaptation, you know, fish out of water almost part of the story. So again, it's very engaging emotionally. You're not put off by any of this. Like I say, it's not sort of beating you over the head with an agenda or condescending to you. It's just kind of pointing out realities that you might not have thought of.
So next thing is they start Steve and her start discussing money troubles of different kinds, and he's telling her that he has a promising job coming up once he gets out of the Marine Corps, and they're supposed to pay him, I think it was $65,000 a year, which it would be a great income, you know, circa 1974, 1975. But there's not a lot, you know. I felt like when he initially told her this that he was definitely holding back, you know, as to what would be the real reality of that. And then a little bit later, they were having a family meal. Leli, I can't remember. I think she said something, and the family, aside from Steve, got after her about it. And Steve immediately jumps to her defense and says that she is his hero. You know, that you know, he cares for her very deeply, but that the judgmental nature that they've been treating her with is really messed up. He didn't outline that specifically, but that was the thrust I felt he was trying to get across. But I thought it was wonderful that he, you know, that he backed up his partner, and especially, you know, that he shared how difficult her transition had been to the States through that lens that you're talking about, that this is entirely new for her. You know, we don't understand, we don't grasp how different this is from what was before, and that people should have a little patience, should have a little more compassion in understanding those kind of things. But it's at that point that just after that discussion that her and Steve talk about what he's actually going to be doing in his new job, and he's going back overseas to sell guns. And you see her facial response to that. I mean, she tears him a new one verbally as well, but just it's the same level. It seemed like the same level of betrayal that she went through earlier with getting exiled from her village. That, you know, that how can he fail to understand the cycle of violence that he's perpetuating, you know, and that he completely misses. He's completely myopic to that reality. It doesn't. I mean, it does register for him what it is, but he's like, I need this good life. You know, I want this $65,000 for my family, and I'm willing to do what I need to do that. And it's also the common trail for service members, going to work for a contractor of some kind, and they probably pay pretty well. But it's a very common thing, and we don't ever really talk about it that much, though, about in terms of the psychological weight there, and about what we're adding back into, adding back in, Aegis missile defense systems and the F-35 and other things like that are just going back to perpetuating war. But Steven, he just entirely misses that. And it's at that point where her trust in him starts to, I don't want to say get diminished, but it's much more tentative than it was before.
It's problematic because he is clearly quite a decent man at heart. For all the bad things he does do in the film, and as we'll get to in the next bit, it does go quite horribly wrong. He is a better man than most, I think, is sort of where he comes down. But like you say, very blinkered about this. He's just thinking about, he's got this ex-wife that he's still paying money to, and he's struggling to support his new family. And, he wants to get out of this economic rut in his life. And this is an opportunity to do that. But that's all he can really see, is that it's an opportunity for that. So I can, get the monkey off my back. He doesn't, like you say, think through the consequences, whereas she can see the consequences having lived them. She can see them straight away. There's no sort of period in between him telling her what this job is actually going to be and like her then reflecting on it and figuring it out. She instantly recognizes, oh, that means you're basically going to be selling stuff that's either going to be shot at or dropped on people like me. And realizes just how different, despite the fact that they've come together at the end of this war, and that it seems like like they could have lived happily ever after, I guess is where I'm going. That because they still ultimately had very different experiences of that war, that they can't live happily ever after, that sort of idealistic, wrap it up with a nice bow tie ending just isn't available to them. And that's a lovely metaphor for how neither of the two countries, the US, well, I guess three countries, North, South Vietnam and the US. I know there were other countries involved in Vietnam, but without getting into all that now, that none of those people could just resolve this thing by ending the war. That doesn't resolve everything. The legacy of the Vietnam War is still being lived by Vietnamese people today, and to a large extent by Americans today, And I liked that they did that. A lot of films, this would have been a 3-act structure where it starts off bad, she then meets Guy and falls in love, and then they go back to America where they have a few struggles, but ultimately everything's fine in the end. That's where the film would have ended. This film, it's like, no, we're still in some ways just getting started. That these people are living through the emotional echoes of that war still. And like I say, that's just a wonderful metaphor for how everyone involved in that war still was. You couldn't just end it by signing a treaty or whatever, or withdrawing troops or something. It's like, well, all of those people still went through things. All of them are still carrying those, particularly the spiritual and emotional scars of that. Those are the things that ultimately never truly heal. You can do better and worse with them, obviously, over time. But it's always there to some extent, as both of us know. So I felt, again, a great way of illustrating that to people in a very, very compelling moment of drama between those two, and really well acted. I mean, they're very well chosen, those two. I thought they played off each other unexpectedly well. I was surprised by sort of how well they worked on screen together, because I wouldn't have necessarily picked them. Again, she's great. But picking Tommy Lee Jones as Steve, not the role he would normally play, particularly at that point in his career. And yet he's great in it. I believed in him. I had a large degree of understanding and compassion for the man, and yet I still kind of found myself hating him at certain moments, because I think you're supposed to, because I think deep within him there is a darkness from that war that does surface, and at this point he's suppressing that. He's trying to ignore it for the sake of the job and the money and trying to move on or whatever, but it's all still there, as we find out as this sort of relationship then frays in the next part of the movie.
So Levi starts to earn a bit of money behind Steve's back, just because she is worried about the inevitable fallout. It doesn't, not real specific on what she wants to do with it, but it's easily understood why she's doing that. And Steve starts drinking more. I know he's been drinking pretty much since he got home, but in terms of seeing him drunk, seeing him lose control and be really angry, this was the first time. And they have an argument about guns, which definitely links back to his job aspirations. And he's talking about taking the boys, his Levi's little boy, and then their own son that they had together, about taking them shooting. And she's very clearly not on board with that, and he ends up physically pulling a shotgun on her and pointing it at her. And you see that he's at this point of desperation. He tells her that he's up for an admin board to be kicked out of the Marine Corps. I want to say he mentioned PTSD, but I don't recall that specifically, but I think that he did. And he tells her some of the horrible things that he did over there. Very specifically, very, that I'm sharing baseball stats, but this is the things that I went through. And he asks himself, if maybe he's nuts, if he's losing his mind, that about learning to become a killer, and that even there, he even at one point points the barrel at himself. And then it takes an interesting turn here, where she shares some of her dirt on the time that she was working with the VC, and she coins it different skin, same suffering, in terms of the overarching idea of them trying to deal with their war crimes, how they're perceiving that what they did was wrong or unacceptable, and that it weighs on them similarly, almost to a conversation that would have happened between two war vets. But this is between man and woman, husband and wife, and you can see that they have a good bonding moment there. And then they continue fighting. Steve ends up kidnapping two of their sons, and he holds having them with him over her head to try to have the divorce that she was seeking thrown out. And then they talk about the concept of soul debt, and I have a little quote here I want to read about that. And so she goes to her priest at the Buddhist temple, and she's trying to figure out what to do next. She's looking for some guidance and hopefully some hope. And he tells the priest, after hearing what she has to say, tells her, quote, "He has created much soul debt for himself, but if you fail to give him the opportunity to redeem himself, you will only increase your own soul debt. The man-hate that blinds you will blind any man you find in a future life. If you turn Steve away, you will be rejecting your own redemption. Child, you have forgiven the man who raped you, destroyed your country, harmed your family. And this is how it should be. Your karma is mixed with Steve. The future, the past are all the same. If you divorce, you will only have to come back again and work it out again. The path to nirvana is never being safe, but tricky and steep. And if you walk only on sunny days, you will never reach your destination. Choose well, my peach blossom. So, what you were mentioning earlier, Tom, about about being stuck in a place where you don't have control over much of the situation, but you do have some control. You have, your immediate circumstance that you can make choices in that small little gap there that you're allowed to. And I think that's exactly what they're hitting the nail on the head here with. That even in uncontrollable situations, we still have to go back and live with them. We have to go back with the choices that we made in those times. And especially because Steve is so much like her. They do have a very clear, empathetic understanding of who each other is. And so she gets on the phone with him. She tells him to come home. She says that she'll try harder. And at some point in the discussion, Steve makes it clear that this is always going to be there. That these things hanging over his head aren't going to leave. And he ends up killing himself. And it gave me a lot of questions about why he ultimately chose to do that. I mean, suicide is never, we should never consider it an acceptable solution, but to understand why people are in so much pain as to get to that point. And clearly here Steve is very much in that place. And, for, just the turn of the narrative that, you could see this thing happen in his mind where he was like, I'm going to continue burdening this woman no matter what I do. And I have to do something. Now, like I said, I don't, none of us would ever tell somebody that they should do that. I would hope somebody like Steve would get help and hopefully be able to return to a greater point of normalcy. But you see that in him, and you see the choice that he made, and it's hard for me to say the words that suicide could be shown as a choice of love, but that's how it felt to me. That's what it was, is that he knew that these burdens weren't just his burdens. They weren't going to remain his burdens. They were going to be the ones of his wife, of his children, and he didn't, at that moment, had no idea what he was going to do about them. What did you think about that, Tom?
Yeah, I mean, that's kind of how I interpreted it, that he almost the primary, I mean, there's never any single one reason why someone kills themselves. Obviously, no. It's there's a whole bunch of stuff there. But that, yeah, I saw it as perhaps the primary reason why he does it is not to end his own suffering, which is, like you say, wrong, but understandable. It's because he doesn't want to cause her to suffer. And this comes so shortly after she goes and has that conversation about soul debt. Mm-hmm. Like you say, their fates are intertwined. And again, this is a metaphor, fairly obvious metaphor. This film is wearing its metaphor openly, that this is actually about two countries, not just two people. Mm-hmm. That if you don't give people a chance to try and resolve things or try and make things better, you're not just denying yourself. You're not just perpetuating your own resentment and your own suffering in a way, but that you're doing that to them as well, because they have no opportunity. I mean, what do you expect them to do but self-destruct in that kind of a circumstance? And that is obviously then what happens. And so it's tying in something very personal. This is ultimately about one man killing himself because he either, well, sort of like I say, a combination of things. He can't take it anymore and he doesn't want to inflict it on the people he loves anymore. With something much more both geopolitical in terms of the war itself and how the two countries needed to try and find a way to move on from it without that just being a kind of ongoing hatred and mutual distrust. But also, again, something metaphysical, that I don't believe in a metaphysical concept of balance per se, but I do believe in, if you like, a kind of moral exchange. I do believe in karma in that sense, that if you like, the more goodness you put into the world, the better the world is for you as well as everyone else. And I kind of felt that's where they were perhaps touching on in terms of Buddhist philosophy, was that she could, quite rightly, and a lot of people would have understood and supported her, just walked away from this guy, just left him to be a wreck. But if she does that, then he's a wreck, and she will always live with that, with the fact that she could have done something different, but essentially chose the option to protect herself. But in, protecting herself, she's also consigning herself to a life of what if, and a life of never truly being able to forgive him. Because obviously after he's dead, she can't really forgive him, or it's sort of almost meaningless at that point. So I love the way that it brought together the by now, at the time we're recording, somewhat hackneyed trope of the traumatized Vietnam veteran. Certainly wasn't so hackneyed back then when the film was made, but how they brought together that, something relatively familiar, I think, to quite a few people by that point, with much broader perspectives, not only on the geopolitics of the war, but on this notion of a moral exchange, whereby sometimes you have to sort of give a little something of yourself up, but it's ultimately better for you in the long run, is a simple way of putting it. But also that she spends so much of the film trying to figure out who she can trust, and ultimately concluding she can't absolutely trust anyone. And that's probably right and probably true. But that she can choose to trust people. She can choose to try and, if you like, be the better person than her fear and her instincts about survival and protection might make her. I took a lot of different things away from what the Buddhist priest tells her. There's a lot in that quote that you read out. I'm trying to unpack little bits and pieces of it, but I'm not sure I'm actually doing that great a job. At any rate, yeah, that's what I was taking away from that point in the movie.
Well, there's also the, and it's the relationship between combatants. That, most people would end up only seeing this as a husband-wife exchange, but that, her offering her love and her empathy to him, for her, it's very much about saving her own soul, but at the same time, she knows that she wants to be there for him, that and in the way that two war buddies are there for each other, not just because they experience the same things, but because they understand that the other guy did too, and there's that bond there, and it would still be seen valid in a valid way if it was two war buddies having this discussion. But I love subverting that obvious way and having a husband and wife who are war buddies, who have talked deeply about the things that they went through and the things that they did, and that it's a measure of loving the whole person, that we can't, like you mentioned about Steve, Steve he's generally a pretty good man, a moral man, but there are aspects to it that even make Steve horrible to be around, but there is no way to separate those things. It's all, it's all taken together in one clump, and you don't get to decide what piece comes and what doesn't. Whether this is somebody's having a good mental day or having a breakdown. That they're. Can you be there for that person in those times? Can you be there when someone is at their absolute worst, and especially when it's about a subject that you yourself carry significant weight alongside? So yeah, and because I think that if reviewers were to look at it today and were to, as they watch the movie, take it as, that would you have the same comment? Would you make the same comment if this was a story about two war buddies versus a husband and wife, in the way that they did it? Because there would be a lot of guys just like, no, I can't talk to my wife about this. I can only talk, you guys are the only ones who understand that. And that, that fear and that lack of trust, that guys may say that, but that doesn't mean that their spouse necessarily feels the same way.
No, sure.
Yeah.
Well, and that I understand why guys feel like that. I do get it. I'm not trying to have a go here.
Yeah.
But in doing that, you are denying both them and you.
Mm-hmm.
And that's ultimately, I think, what the priest is saying is that, I don't even know if priest is the right word in Buddhism, but whatever.
Yeah, I'm not sure what the title is for their.
Buddhists aren't exactly known for sending angry emails, so I think
no.
But yeah, that's ultimately the lesson there, that by shying away and by giving in to those self-protective instincts, which we all do in life. So I do get it. I've done this, and I'm saying it was wrong when I did it. It was a bad decision when I did it, just as I'm saying it would be for anyone else, is that denying the chance to form a greater bond is a bad thing. And we should all try and be a little bit more brave and honest when it comes to that, trying to do that.
Absolutely. Now, we're getting to the end of the film here. I know she returned to Vietnam when she was older. Wasn't there another trip that she made when her sons were still younger? Or am I thinking it's all one trip together? I'm trying to remember.
No, as I recall, those are supposed to be two separate trips at two different moments. Or at least that's how I remember the film. I mean, both of us could be misremembering, but yeah, I think so.
So she goes back to Vietnam, and she finds her mom in a very decrepit state, having physical issues of all kinds, and her mom tells her that she's a ghost, that essentially that for their culture that her spirit isn't being seen by their ancestors. I think that was what she was trying to get across. And her brother has, he's returned from his time fighting with the VC, and he is very angry and bitter about the damage done to Vietnam by the Americans, and also that that finding his mom in this poor and unworkable state, and he lays that on Leli. He lays that that we could have done more if you were here. Why did you leave us? Why did you abandon us? I don't know that she coins it that way, but that was
that's where it's going. Yeah.
And then some years later, she makes a second trip. Her mom has passed, but she brings her sons, and they go to her village, and it's a very different experience than the first time. People are happy to see her kids. No one. Her mom had already passed away. and you can see that there, this whole thing in her introducing her sons to people in her village, and that there was a reconnection for her there in terms of the land, in terms of the place of her ancestors, one that did not happen earlier. It took her that long to feel comfortable with that idea again. And that's essentially the end of the film. There's a couple different little quotes that she made at the end that I wanted to go over, and one that's very powerful to me. She said that, in cemeteries there are no enemies. They're just dead soldiers. And I remember having a thought something like that when I first went to Arlington National Cemetery, because buried in Arlington there are Confederate soldiers that died. There's not very many of them, but there are some there. And that we cling to this idea of friendly and enemy so tightly that we don't really reckon with that both sides have to carry the same weight of one way or another, whether they be physical injuries, psychological injuries, environmental damage to their homes. That there really is a firm weight in that. And actually through Vietnam veterans, going back there and talking to people, meeting with their former enemy combatants that fought against them, and that this is very possible what Lee Lai goes through here. Granted, she is returning to her country's home, whereas Americans that never called Vietnam home, but that they wrap their minds around the idea of the destruction that they brought. But the last thing I'll add to that is what she says right as the film wraps, talking about heaven and earth changing places many times. And of course, heaven and earth, like you mentioned earlier, Vietnam and America, sky and land, I think was one thing that she said, east and west, that and it is about specifically that idea of what is seen as friendly, what is seen as combative, what is seen as the enemy. And that we try to reach for a much greater understanding of that back and forth than we generally have, and that over a lifetime our allegiances are going to change. They're going to be affected by all of that, and we have to look at it in the total arc. You can't just look at it, well, this dude chose to go to this war, he fought, this happened, the end. It has to be looked at as a reckoning of the whole, of the complete tale there.
Yeah, the line about heaven and earth switching places. Another parallel would be, of course, masculine and feminine, because they switch places several times throughout the course of the movie, particularly in Lee Lai and Steve's relationship, but also in other places too. And yeah, it's not the most satisfying of endings, and I don't mean that in the sense that it. Because the resolution is uneasy, I think you couldn't finish this movie with a simple, easy resolution. You can find some resolution, but it's always going to be a somewhat uneasy, difficult one. But also, just simply because how on earth do you finish a story like this? No matter what ending they'd chosen, I think I would have come away feeling a little bit like... that I just wouldn't have been entirely satisfied with it. I don't think you can ever end a story like this in an entirely satisfactory way. And you shouldn't, because real life does go on. And, all of the real people that were actually depicted in this film, they're all, their lives carried on after the events of the movie finished. So as to the whole... Yeah, this goes back to what I was saying about the moral exchange. This switching between heaven and earth, this, the way things keep changing roles and switching sides throughout the course of the movie. Not only does it illustrate that, in fact, to a large extent, that notion of being on opposing sides is actually a deception, a sort of willing self-deception in a lot of cases. While it may also simultaneously be a pragmatic necessity that you have to pick a side because there are two sides, because so many people believe in this deception, it becomes a reality. So then you have to choose. And that's something that very much comes up in this movie in practically every moment, to be honest. But yeah, like I say, this notion of a moral exchange, that you can, even in dire circumstances, you still have some degree of choice, and you can choose either the, if you like, negative, self-protective, almost isolationist approach to things, or you can try and maintain human bonds, spiritual and emotional bonds that ultimately, like, what else really is there of meaning in life? And even though that will sometimes be hurtful and dangerous, and it will make you vulnerable, better things will come from that. After the pain and the fear, you will find a more profound bond. And that's something that is almost sacred, or perhaps is sacred. So you see what I mean? It's not as simple as actions have consequences, but it is if you choose a more, if you like, masculine, shut off, somewhat paranoid and fearful and hostile approach to things, that will, ripple out into other areas of your life. You will face some degree of consequence from that. Likewise, if you choose the other approach. And so there is always a sort of exchange between your choice and the consequences of it, whether it's for you and whether it's for someone else. And going back to what we were saying about Steve, the guy, at least in part, kills himself because he doesn't want to cause someone he loves to suffer. But of course, by killing himself, he causes her to suffer. So again, this notion of an exchange, that's at the core of this. And I think what Oliver Stone may have been trying to say by telling this story is that it's not as simple as both sides should just forgive each other and move on, in that sort of, like that childish way that when you're having a fight with your brother or something and your parents tell you to do that. It's like, but that doesn't really work though, does it? We can fake it if you want. It's usually what happens. But, there is still always going to be some degree of lingering resentment or competition or whatever it is that caused the fight in the first place. It's nothing as trite or as simplistic as that. It's more that forgiving is good for everyone. It doesn't allow you to simply move on. There is no simple moving on from something like the Vietnam War, but there is a degree of forgiveness and understanding and compassion that we can build that at least heals some of that horror. You'll never heal all of it. And that's why the ending of the film is so kind of unsatisfactory and uneasy, is because all of this pain that can't be solved and healed is still going to be there. But some of it you can. And that's far better than nothing. It's certainly far better than remaining in a situation of mutual hostility and paranoia and hatred and resentment and shame and fear and guilt and grief and all the rest of it. If you can move on from some of that, then it's better for everyone. That's kind of ultimately what I took away from this film, and I totally agree with it. If that's what Oliver Stone was getting at, then yeah, I'm totally on board.
Absolutely. Great point. I remember Tim Robbins talking about how he was referring to the Shawshank Redemption, about how that his character, how Andy Dufresne earned his happy ending, And again, it's similar to this, that the horrors of him being in that prison for that long, especially that he was a legitimately innocent person, it's not always going to go away. But after having seen everything we went through, that it's easy and cathartic to say that he did earn the peace and the goodness that he got at the end. And I would have to say for this film that despite that kind of, uneasy ending part, that the peace that Leli found for herself was legitimately earned, and it wasn't gotten, that she didn't, just go find herself a new house and a new situation there in America, just become another consumer in that way, but finding, because there's no spirit in that. There's no connection in that. And she was willing to go back to these places. She went back to Steve and said, "Hey, I'm with you. I'm in this. I know it's hard, but I'm not gonna. If you're looking for somebody to give up, it's not going to be me." And as she, makes those steps for herself and ultimately coming back and making her peace with her village, her family, that she did do the hard work of getting that little drop of a good ending, if we want to coin it as a good ending in that way. But that the nature of being pulled between two poles wasn't going to go away, but that she had attempted to accept her place in it. Sometimes the more powerful thing isn't the recovery in and of itself. It's that someone chose to go for it. They chose that I was going to do this, and that it was hard, and I went through a lot of stuff for it, but I'm better because of it. Even if it was hard, even if it tore my soul apart, that and it's not to say it was easy. I think some people make that typical error of thinking that, if I just say the magic words, if I say, I forgive them or this or that it comes with its own set of benefits like that. And it doesn't. The resentment against the enemy, missing your fallen comrades, all of the damage that can be done to the human soul in the context of war, we never put any of those things down. And so I think that Oliver did a good job of mapping those two things together at the end, that there was some peace. It wasn't complete, total peace, but there was some that she found, and that we, as the Western world, viewing media like this, that we need to be more willing and able to accept those harsh realities and to dive into it, earnestly, which is something that most Americans don't do. We have this very, very detached view of our history, of our, we cling to the heroics and shun the bad things. And if we do admit bad things, they were bad eggs, they were bad apples. They're not, it was not something that anyone could have done anything about, which isn't true in the slightest. But I think Oliver did a good job putting those two together, that there was a modicum of peace and the understanding that it goes on, that it doesn't end. It doesn't end for any combatant, I don't think. You deal with it in one way or another.
Well, and just like his previous films, but even more so with this one, it's very therapeutic.
Mm-hmm.
I can imagine a lot of people. I mean, I don't even know anyone directly who fought in Vietnam on any side. I don't have any personal connection to that war, and yet I found it therapeutic. It, a war that happened before I was born, and that doesn't sort of certainly personally mean an awful lot to me.
Yeah.
However much it might mean politically and in other, aspects of my life. So I can only imagine that for people from any side of that conflict, this film can help them. It's useful to them. It can map out a path beyond the usual answers to these things. Because all too often, I mean, you see this is a terrible place to source anything, to be honest, but you see this a lot on Reddit, right? Anyone has any kind of emotional problem on Reddit, it's, oh, you need therapy, and then you'll solve your emotional problem. And it's like, yeah, okay, therapy. I'm not trying to just dismiss therapy here at all. It can be very useful to a lot of people for a lot of reasons. But most of the time, what you get out of it is better ways of dealing with your emotional troubles rather than understanding and completely overcoming them.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I guess it does depend how deep those troubles lie. I mean, if it's some relatively surface thing, then you may be able to totally overcome it. But when it's something deep like this, guilt and grief and what we've been discussing throughout this whole conversation, those things never can be truly overcome. What you can do is find a way to, like you say, get some peace. If you can not feel like that most of the time, that's certainly a hell of a lot better than feeling like that most of the time. So that's what happens in terms of Lilai's arc in the story. In the end, she does get some degree of peace and resolution, and so do we, the audience.
Mm-hmm.
It's you said it up top. It's a very cathartic movie. There's a lot of. There isn't actually that much blood in this film, but there's a lot of mud.
Yeah.
It's sort of almost in place of the blood. There's a lot of dirt in this film, and more importantly, there's an awful lot of pain. But there is also a huge amount of inspiration to compassion. It's very hard, I can imagine, for most people who actually sat through this whole film, rather than the ones you mentioned earlier who would like turn it off 20 minutes in because, she's just some, commie peasant or whatever.
Yeah.
For anyone else, they must have come away from this feeling more, being a more compassionate person, feeling more compassion, understanding these things better, and being provoked to actually carry that forward. To not just say, that's the end of the movie and that's the lesson, and then you forget about it the following day.
Yeah.
But, to actually make a difference to people in just the same way as Platoon and Born on the Fourth did. But I think even more so because it's such an unusual and unexpected movie. No one else would have made a film like this except Oliver Stone. Let's face it. No one would have even thought to. And that's a testament to the man, of course, that he was willing. And at that point in his career, when he was really quite hot, Oscar-winning film director Oliver Stone, and he was like, no, fuck it. I'm going to tell this story that, even if it's a commercial failure, for the people who do get to see it, it will be so cathartic and therapeutic that that's the value of it. That's its importance as a movie. And I think he did it. I think he did it brilliantly. I'm kind of in love with this movie, as you probably got from the way that I'm talking about it quite enthusiastically and have almost nothing but overwhelmingly positive things to say about it. But it's because it is such a rarity. There are so few movies like this, and I can't think of another one that does this so well. So yeah, everyone go out and watch it. If you haven't seen this movie, or if you haven't seen it like me in like 30 years or something, possibly not that long, but yeah, it will bring out the best in people, I think.
Yeah, definitely, guys. Please, if you haven't had a chance to watch this movie, it is absolutely worth the watch. And as a veteran, as a soldier, I found it very cathartic, and I so enjoyed Platoon and Born on the Fourth for their honesty, and that this movie certainly does not fail, and especially that it shows a different arc to the American GI experience than the normal one that's shown in the movie, and even including Platoon and Born on the Fourth, that you see this person, Steve drinking a lot, having flashbacks, dealing with PTSD on a very serious level, and then ultimately killing himself. That there are a lot of veterans, I think, that could empathize with that place, knowing that you contain in you, the chance to do awful things, even awful things to the people that you care about, and wanting to find some peace, wanting to find some some kind of respite away from that. And it, like we discussed earlier, it doesn't. It may get a little bit easier, but these are generally the things that people carry. These are the things that they carry all the time. But back to what you were saying about really loving it, is I would honestly put it up next to Platoon and Born on the Fourth as being at least equal to, if not greater than, the stories that they got across and that Oliver got across in those films. And those films were glorious as well. I'm watching Platoon for the first time. I was just so enlivened to see a realistic depiction of how soldiers deal with each other like that. And in this one, and especially taking both the Vietnamese angle and the storytelling power and empathy of a woman being the protagonist, I think it was a great risk. And it really sucks to me that not very many people saw it, but yeah, such a powerful movie. Yeah, and I lost my train of thought. That's probably a good place for us to end right there.
Yeah, I think we're both we're struggling to quite put into words anything else about this film except just the kind of profound impact it had on both of us. Yeah, let's wrap it up.
All right. Well, Tom, thank you so much for coming and chatting with me about this today. Do you have is there anything that you wanted to share with the audience, upcoming work that you wanted to plug a little bit, to be on the lookout for?
Well, as I imagine regular listeners of my podcast will know, both the documentary and the new book are coming out at some point later this year, but I can't guarantee exactly when because both are not quite finalized yet. But yeah, I mean, keep an eye on my site, spyculture.com, because there's always more content that I'm doing coming out, and there's a few major things in the pipeline, like the book and the documentary, that I think are really something special. I've really, especially with the book, because I've had more control over it, I'm not directing the documentary, really tried to sort of push the boundaries of what it's possible to say about these kinds of things, and in particular the whole government entertainment media relationship. But yeah, nothing sort of imminent, certainly.
Well, I for one am very excited to see the documentary and the book, so I hope you'll come back and chat with us again and talk about those when that finally comes around.
Oh, of course, I'd love to. I'm actually really interested to hear what you have to say about both of them, because as always, when we discuss, I mean, we're coming from a similar place in that we're quite similar people, but we have such different backgrounds and experiences. Mm-hmm. And so it's always fascinating for me, and I'm always learning stuff. And I'm guessing it's the same for you, that, we have I don't know why this is, we have this natural kinship, me and you, given that we come from quite different places and what have you, but we do. And that's a great thing to have. And yeah, love talking to you, man, and looking forward to the next one.
The feeling is absolutely mutual, brother. I really enjoy these talks we have, and we just to let everybody know, Tom and I now have a monthly recording spot, so hopefully you'll be hearing quite a few more of these as time goes on. So thanks again, Tom. We'll talk to you soon.
Yeah, thanks, man. Anytime.
We're on Twitter at Fortress on a Hill, and also at Facebook.com at Fortress on a Hill. You can find our main blog page and our full collection of episodes at www.fortressonahill.com. iTunes, Stitcher, Google Podcasts, Patreon, Spotify. You name it, almost anywhere you listen, we're already waiting for you. And hey, we're always in the market for more Patreon supporters. Please consider becoming a patron at patreon.com. And if you're not into giving us a monthly payment, think about giving us a couple bucks on PayPal. The link is in the show notes. Skepticism is one's best armor. Never forget it. We'll see you next time.
my song. I hope you'll pay attention. I will not